At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI garbage. What's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Daniel Pierce, and I'm going to be your narrator. Now, let's begin. The Grand War Chamber on the Ascended Throne World served as his stage, a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. Floors of polished black basalt stretched into infinity, reflecting the cold, distant light of a captive star. The air, scrubbed of all life and personality, carried the scent of sterile filters and a cloying metallic incense. 1,000 dignitaries from 100 vassal worlds sat in tiered rows. Their varied form, beings of jointed shell, creatures of scaled flesh, columns of contained vapor, and others, were united in a single rigid stillness. The ritual of glorious sanction and fealty commenced. First came the declaration, then came the tithe. Each dignitary would publicly pledge ships, resources, and bodies to the Emperor's righteous cause. This well-honed instrument of consolidating power crushed dissent before it could sprout. "For the insolence!" Emperor Vergox's voice boomed, amplified by hidden acoustics that gave it the weight of a geological event. He stood before his throne of polished black stone, a towering figure. His ornate armor of gold and crimson remained pristine, untouched by the reality of conflict. "For their refusal to accept the gift of imperial harmony, for their barbaric adherence to chaos, I, Vergox IV, Emperor of 1,000 suns, voice of the grand doctrine, do hereby declare a state of righteous annihilation upon the race known as humanity." The speech droned on, a self-important recitation of historical precedents and ritualistic threats, a script performed countless times. It always concluded with a swift and bloody curtain call. Hundreds of dignitaries from dozens of species fixed their gaze on the lone figure at a polished table in the center of the floor. Humanity's representative, Robert Derringer, looked less like a diplomat and more like a man who just misplaced his favorite coffee mug. His suit was rumpled, his hair a mess, and his posture projected a masterclass in profound indifference. The Emperor finished the grand pronouncement, the final words echoing with the promise of inevitable cleansing fire. He paused for effect. The only sound was the faint hum of the chamber's life support. This was the moment of submission, the part of the play where the target species understood the futility of resistance. After this, the pledging of fealty would begin and his power would stand absolute once more. Instead, a chair scraped against basalt. The sound, shockingly loud, violated the sanctified quiet. Robert Derringer pushed his chair from the table. He looked, if anything, even more bored than before. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, soft pack of cigarettes. The label, barely legible, read "Red Death" in stark, blocky letters, a brand known throughout human space for its harsh, unfiltered, and unapologetically carcinogenic contents. He shook one out and placed it between his lips. From another pocket, he produced a battered, brass-colored lighter, a relic shaped like an archaic Terran fire starter. A flick of his thumb sparked a small coil at its tip, which glowed a silent, violent cherry red. An Imperial guard, a behemoth of muscle and polished armor, took a single menacing step forward, his plasma rifle rising at this flagrant breach of regulation. Before he could take a second step, a nearby ascended dignitary, a creature of spindly limbs and mirrored eyes, hissed a sharp rebuke in a high, formal dialect, a tongue kept for the most sacred court rituals. Without taking his gaze from the Emperor, Derringer touched the glowing coil to his cigarette's tip. It smoldered to life. He took a long, slow drag, his cheeks hollowing for a moment. Then, with the dignitary still in his peripheral vision, he replied in the same obscure dialect, his accent flawless and unforced. "Patience is a virtue," Derringer said, the ancient words rolling off his tongue like his native language. "Even when your master lacks it." The dignitary froze, his mirrored eyes widening into perfect circles of shock. A murmur like the rustling of dry leaves rippled through the audience. This shabby, unimpressive primate was a complete unknown, yet he spoke the high tongue better than most of the court. Grand Marshal Corthalis, standing at the Emperor's right hand, a warrior of impeccable discipline and strategic genius, felt a spike of analytical curiosity pierce his ceremonial calm. An anomaly. He sent a subvocal command to his internal archive link. Data scrolled across his vision, unseen by any other. Subject, Robert Derringer. Species, human. Title, Envoy Directorate of First Contact and Emergency Response. Notations, former xenoanthropologist. Academic specialty, Dead and Archaic Imperial Languages, Valedictorian. Corthalis processed the information in a microsecond. This was a calculated insult. The human's entire career seemed a preparation for this very moment. Derringer ignored them all. He exhaled a long, disrespectful cloud of acrid smoke that coiled in the sterile air like a defiant ghost. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he ground the lit cigarette end out on the priceless, mirror-polished table surface, leaving a greasy black smudge on its perfection. He shrugged. "All right," he said, his voice flat and utterly unimpressed in the common galactic tongue. "Your funeral." Days later, the command bridge of the Imperial flagship, Unquestionable Mandate, operated as a cathedral of quiet competence. Every officer stood at their station, a study in disciplined composure. The filtered air, scrubbed to absolute purity, smelled of nothing. On the main holo display, a three-dimensional representation of the Sol system rotated slowly. Jupiter, a marble giant dominating the view. Grand Marshal Corthalis watched the human fleet assemble. He felt a wave of something between pity and contempt. They were a pathetic joke. Converted asteroid miners with oversized industrial lasers still bolted to their chassis, their hulls scarred and pitted from decades of hard labor. Bulk freighters with missile pods crudely welded to their cargo containers. A swarm of tiny orbital tugs flitting around the larger ships like gnats around a beast of burden. "They are laborers with weapons, Grand Marshal," his tactical officer reported, his voice dripping with disdain. "Their positioning is a chaotic swarm. They are simply milling about." "Indeed," Corthalis murmured. The display insulted the very art of war. It possessed no grandeur, no discipline, no adherence to the sacred geometry of fleet arrangement. A junkyard with engines had been sent to meet them. He gave the order, his voice crisp and certain. "Execute the glorious advance of inevitability. Standard wedge deployment. Full plasma barrage on my mark. We will cleanse this system of their disorderly presence." The Ascendant fleet, 100 ships of the line, perfect and identical, moved. They advanced in a flawless wedge, a wall of metallic certainty designed to shatter the morale and hulls of any enemy. Corthalis expected the battle to last less than an hour. A simple, clean extermination would offer another textbook victory for the annals of the Grand Doctrine. The humans, it turned out, had ignored the textbook. As the Imperial fleet crossed the orbital plane of Callisto, the human ships scattered. They formed no line to meet them in glorious combat. They dove into the dense asteroid fields between Jupiter and Mars, vanished behind the radiation-soaked bulk of Ganymede, and used the immense gravitational pull of Jupiter itself to perform high-speed slingshot maneuvers. The Ascendant targeting computers, programmed for predictable fleet engagements in open space, stuttered and choked. They were designed to track the elegant, predictable arcs of warships, not the chaotic three-dimensional madness of 1,000 individual objects moving without pattern or reason. "Sir," the tactical officer said, his composure cracking for the first time, "we have an incoming vessel, a large mining hauler. Hull designation Rock Chewer. It's on a roaming course." Corthalis glanced at the display. The ship was massive but slow, a desperate, pathetic gesture. Target its engines. A warning shot. Before the order's execution, the rock chewer did something unexpected. It accelerated. It fired no weapons. It simply vented. Its entire overloaded reactor core, pushed far beyond every safety limit, erupted in a silent, blossoming flower of pure incandescent plasma. It was raw, uncontrolled energy. A fragment of a star washed over the left flank of the Imperial line. The battlecruiser, the Emperor's Gaze, its shields designed to repel focused energy blast, was simply engulfed. Its systems overloaded. Its hull superheated to the melting point in a fraction of a second. It drifted away, a silent, glowing wreck. Before Corthalis could process this act of dishonorable, self-destructive madness, a new wave of contacts appeared, small, fast-moving. "Are they fighters?" he demanded. "Negative, Grand Marshal," the comms officer reported, a note of utter confusion in his voice. "They are advertising satellites, repurposed. They're broadcasting." On the bridge's auxiliary screens, the broadcast appeared. Using sophisticated deepfake technology, the humans plastered Emperor Vergox's stern, regal face onto the body of a ridiculously cheerful, gesticulating actor. The Emperor's stolen likeness now enthusiastically sold discount starships, used car style. Simultaneously, every open Ascendant tactical channel flooded with noise. It was music of a sort, a repetitive, madly cheerful, high-pitched song about a small aquatic predator and its family. Do 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 do. And beneath it, a cacophony from thousands of open mic channels from human tugboats shouted jokes, arguments over sports teams, and horribly off-key singing. Corthalis stared in disbelief as his disciplined officers frantically purged the infantile noise from their comms. His fleet was blinded by chaos, deafened by idiocy, and crippled by exploding garbage trucks. "This is lunacy," he murmured, a cold dread creeping into his soul. The Grand Doctrine had no chapter for this, no precedent for an enemy that treated warfare like a prank. It's chaos given form. The thought was heretical, a whisper from the oldest, darkest parts of their history, time before the Doctrine brought order. He pushed the thought away. These were just primates, annoying, self-destructive, dishonorable primates. But the evidence was before him. A messy, ridiculous, and brutally effective strategy that cost him ships and men. The glorious extermination became a bloody, humiliating bar fight. The ground invasion of Mars was meant to be a show of overwhelming force. Ascendant legions, their silver armor reflecting the thin Martian sun, marched towards the domed city of Olympus Village. They were accompanied by Drexorian shock troops, hulking, gray-skinned aliens conscripted into Imperial service, their powerful frames encased in pitted functional iron. They expected a pitched battle on the plains outside the city. Traditional confrontation of armor against infantry. The honorable way. The Ascendant way. Instead, the humans drew them into the labyrinthine maw of Mariner Valley, a vast canyon system that sprawled for thousands of miles. The Ascendants marched in, confident in their numbers and superior firepower. They marched into a miles-long, networked kill box. The first landslide came from a series of time-shaped charges planted weeks in advance. An entire platoon of Ascendant regulars was buried under 1,000,000 tons of red rock without firing a single shot. From that moment, the valley became a hellscape. Every cave mouth, every rock ledge, every shadow seemed to hide a sniper with a high-caliber rail rifle that fired a silent, hypervelocity slug. Harbinger, a veteran Drexorian sergeant, was in the first wave. His squad was ordered to secure a narrow pass. They advanced cautiously, their heavy boots kicking up clouds of fine red dust. A glorious plasma blast or roaring explosion never came. An IED made from a repurposed terraforming drill hit them. The device vibrated instead of exploding. It sent a high-frequency resonance wave through the ground, liquefying the rock beneath their feet. The solid ground turned to a slurry of red mud in an instant. Harbinger, his reflexes honed by 100 campaigns, threw himself backward on solid rock. Half his squad was less fortunate. They sank into the superheated sludge, their armor cooking them alive. As they struggled, a new threat emerged. A cloying synthetic cherry scent filled the air as a fine mist sprayed from hidden nozzles in the canyon walls. It was a non-toxic but incredibly slippery polymer gel. The heavily armored Ascendant shock troops marching behind Harbinger's position hit the gelled rock at a full run. The result was a slapstick routine from hell. 7-foot-tall killing machines, the pride of the Imperial legions, suddenly found their feet sliding out from under them. They pinwheeled their arms, crashed into each other, and tumbled into prepared kill zones, where human snipers erased them with a cold, impersonal rhythm. Harbinger lay flat behind a rock and watched the massacre unfold. He saw the brutal calculus of an enemy that refused to fight with honor. They cared little for glory or duels. They cared only for killing his people in the most direct way possible. And through it all, he saw the Ascendant command walkers, positioned safely miles to the rear, directing their charges into the meat grinder. The Empire saw his life and the lives of his Trixorian brothers as utterly, completely expendable. Night fell on Mariner Valley and brought a deceptive quiet. The fighting ground to a halt as the humans, knowing their technological disadvantages, melted into the rockwork. In a makeshift aid station carved into a cave, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, the sharp scent of cauterized wounds and blood. Harbinger ignored the stinging gash on his own arm. He found a young Trixorian from his squad, a kid barely out of his hatching crash, who shivered on a cot. A plasma burn seared through his leg armor, leaving a ragged, blackened wound. The kid tried to be brave, but his eyes were wide with pain and fear. Wordlessly, Harbinger knelt beside him. He uncapped his personal water ration, a precious, heavily guarded commodity in the dry Martian environment, and poured a small amount onto a clean strip of cloth. He gently cleaned the wound's edges, his huge, callous hands surprisingly gentle. The younger soldier muttered his thanks, his voice cracking. An ascended officer, his silver armor still pristine in the dim light of the glow strips, strode past. He paused, looking down at the scene with disdain. "Strooper!" He snapped at Harbinger, bothering with neither his name nor designation. "Conserve your resources. Imperial regulation dictates that all assets maintain peak functionality. Damaged assets will be reevaluated for combat readiness in the morning." The officer spared no glance for the wounded Trixorian on the cot. He was a damaged asset, not a soldier. A line item on a logistical report. The Ascendant turned and walked away, his armored boots clicking with arrogant purpose on the stone floor. Harbinger stared at his back, his jaw so tight he felt his teeth creak. He said nothing. He simply uncapped his canteen again and carefully, deliberately, poured the rest of his water into the young soldier's own canteen. His loyalty was to the blood on the cot, not to the pristine silver armor. Robert Derringer operated from a grimy, grease-stained workshop on a fortified asteroid base hidden deep within the chaos of the Kuiper Belt. The place was a monument to organized chaos. Wires snaked across the floor like metallic vines, salvaged parts piled high on every available surface. The air was a rich cocktail of smells, burnt wiring, superheated metal, the bitter tang of overbrewed coffee, and the faint coppery scent of human sweat. He shared a flask of potent home-distilled whiskey with a grizzled, cybernetically augmented engineer named Sal. Sal, whose left arm was a complex mesh of whirring servos and polished chrome, excitedly gestured at a holographic schematic with his robotic hand. "So get this, Bob," Sal said, his voice buzzing with the thrill of discovery. "We networked the navigation AI from a fleet of old atmospheric crop dusters. The things were designed to spray protein gel on algae farms, right? The whole purpose was to avoid birds. Turns out, the flight patterns of an Ascendant point defense swarm are quite similar to a flock of angry space geese." He grinned, revealing a few missing teeth. "We turned our dumbfire missiles into a surprisingly sophisticated swarm guidance system. Cheap, dirty, effective." Derringer took a swig from the flask, the harsh liquor burning a welcome trail down his throat. He looked around the workshop at the faces of the mechanics and programmers. They were kids, most of them. Young men and women who should have been designing video games or mapping new star systems, not figuring out how to weaponize farm equipment. For a brief, unguarded moment, his tired, cynical demeanor faltered, revealing the idealist buried deep beneath. He saw their resourcefulness, their ingenuity, their terrifying adaptability. He clapped Sal on his fleshy shoulder, the one of metal. "God, I hate that you're all so damn good at this," he said, his voice a rough mix of immense pride and profound sadness. Then his impassive expression returned. He looked at the schematic, the grim reality of the situation settling back over him. "They expect chess," he said, his voice flat once more. "Let's flip the table and hit him with a chair." A 19-year-old hacker who called herself Evie worked from a server farm hidden inside a hollowed-out ice comet. Her only companion, the quiet hum of the life support and the endless stream of data flowing across her dozen monitors. She found a vulnerability, a crack in the Empire's monolithic arrogance. The Ascendants, in their infinite self-regard, used a top-tier encrypted military network for their own communications. But for their vassal species, the Drexorians, the Shailene administrators, the Carthian merchants, they used a less secure, lower-tier comms network, a digital servant's entrance built on the assumption that their subjects were too stupid or too cowed to ever use it against them. Evie launched no frontal assault. She made no attempt to break their master encryption. She slipped in through the servant's entrance. She uploaded tiny data packets disguised as routine firmware updates, low-priority logistical manifest and system diagnostic reports. The files were dormant, invisible, waiting for a specific synchronized time code. When the moment came, her symphony of static began. On mess hall monitors, on personal data pads, on the auxiliary screens of bridges across the entire vassal fleet, the regular Imperial programming was replaced. This was no propaganda. There was no rousing speeches or smiling human faces. It was raw, unedited combat footage, pulled from the helmet cams of dead soldiers and the drone feeds of destroyed outposts. It showed a small squad of 4 human Marines, their armor scorched and cracked, holding a narrow corridor against a horde of Drexorian shock troops. It showed their ammo counters ticking to 0, followed by the sight of them drawing combat knives and charging into certain death. It showed a civilian freighter pilot, her face a mixture of terror and defiance, screaming into her comms as she deliberately rammed her unarmed ship into the side of an Imperial destroyer to give a medical transport a few extra seconds to escape. Evie stripped out the original audio of screams and explosions. Instead, she set the raw, brutal footage to the most defiant and rousing classical music from Earth's long and bloody history. She unleashed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony over the site of a desperate last stand. Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries as jury-rigged fighters swarmed a battlecruiser, and Holst Mars, the bringer of war, as the canyons of Mariner Valley erupted in fire and death. It was an internal infection, a virus of pure human defiance, broadcast almost exclusively to the vassal troops the Empire depended on to fight its wars. In a cramped metallic barracks on a conquered world orbiting Tau Ceti, Harbinger and his fellow Drexorians huddled around a hidden personal datapad. The illegal human broadcast flickered to life. The memory of the cold ascendant officer in the aid station, the one who called his dying friend a damaged asset, was still a fresh, raw wound in his mind. He watched the footage. He saw an enemy that fought with a ferocity he had never encountered, a species that treated certain death as a final strategic option. More importantly, he saw his own people, the Drexorians, sent in as waves of cannon fodder while Ascendant officers directed the slaughter from the safety of their command post. He saw his brothers dying for Ascendant glory. The alien music swelled, a strange and powerful symphony of strings and brass and thunderous percussion. He failed to understand its meaning, but he understood its emotion. It spoke of sacrifice, of defiance, of a glory that had nothing to do with emperors or doctrines. "They die for each other," One of the other Drexorians growled, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Harbinger, his eyes glowing dimly in the dark. Why do we die for their masters? Harbinger offered no answer. He just kept watching the screen, his massive hands clenched into fists. His silence was grim, unspoken agreement. The seeds of doubt had found fertile ground. Deep within the administrative heart of the Ascendant Empire, on a planet named Ordinatus, there was one single continent-spanning data center. Scribe Veritas 7 noticed a pattern. The patterns were all that mattered. The human resistance introduced chaos into his perfect system. Logistical requests spiked in unpredictable, irrational ways. Damaged ships needed unplanned repairs. Annihilated legions needed replacement ahead of schedule. The Ascendant High Command, rigidly adhering to the unwavering timetables of the Grand Doctrine, refused to adjust supply chain regulations. The result was a chain reaction of massive breakdowns. To Scribe Veritas 7, the Empire was a flawless equation, a symphony of pure logical order. This war was a discordant note, an irrational variable that threatened the integrity of the entire composition. He saw the humans as a secondary problem. His analysis identified the Emperor's illogical, pride-driven refusal to adapt as the primary system error. The system needed correction. He began his work, a quiet campaign of malicious compliance. He pulled up the manifest for a crucial shipment of plasma cells destined for the Tau Ceti fleet. Then he typed, his movements deliberate and fluid. He filed a report, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive weaponized procedure. Pursuant to Imperial Purity Statute 941 Delta, he wrote, his voice a flat monotone as he dictated to the system. Originally enacted to prevent the spread of mollusk parasites during the pacification of the 7th millennium, a potential energy signature anomaly has been detected in cargo batch 81 Kilo. A mandatory 60-day quarantine and triple verification process is hereby initiated. While this action will regrettably delay the Tau Ceti fleet's resupply, systemic integrity must be maintained above all else. Order is paramount. He sent the report. He needed no virus or bomb to cripple the war machine. He crashed the system with its own bloated, inflexible, and utterly sacred bureaucracy. Grand Marshal Corthalis stood before the Emperor's throne once more. The Grand War Chamber's air felt colder than usual. Between them, a hollow display showed the Ascendant territory gained in a sea of blood. But the numbers scrolling beneath told a different story. Asset losses were 500% higher than sanitized reports, suboptimal. The humans failed to follow the known patterns of warfare, Your Majesty. Corthalis said, his voice a model of respectful restraint. Their strategies are chaotic, their tactics dishonorable. They exploit our adherence to the doctrine. I formally request permission to deviate, to adapt all tactics to counter their irrationality. The Emperor's reaction was volcanic. He rose from his throne, his face contorted with purple rage. Heresy! He bellowed, his voice cracking the chamber's oppressive silence. The doctrine is why we prevail! The doctrine is the embodiment of order! Your weakness, Marshal, your failure of will, is the only flaw in our design. You will adapt to nothing. You will overwhelm, double the assault, grind them to dust with the weight of our will. Dismissed and publicly humiliated, Corthalis returned to his private quarters on the flagship. The quiet felt suffocating. Frustrated, he pulled up the sacred text of the Grand Doctrine on a datapad, his fingers tapping a rapid sequence across the screen. He searched desperately for any loophole, any forgotten precedent that might justify adaptation. He scrolled past chapters on orbital bombardment patterns and honorable ground engagements. He found himself in the archaic, almost mythical sections at the text back, clauses that had slumbered for millennia. One title caught his eye: Thronefall Contingencies. He opened the file. It was a paranoid relic from a forgotten, more chaotic age, a time before the Empire's dominance was absolute. a single entry stood out. Contingency 0. In the event of confirmed lineage decapitation, all fleets are to immediately disengage from all combat operations. All commands are to return to the core for systemic preservation and succession procedures. No other order supersedes. He scoffed. Lineage decapitation. The Emperor's assassination. An irrelevant fantasy. The Emperor was the safest being in the galaxy. He closed the file, his frustration boiling over. He was a master strategist, forced to fight a child's chaotic game with his hands tied by the very traditions he swore his life to uphold. Derringer received the coded message on a secure channel. A faction of Carthian merchants, notorious profiteers, offered to sell humanity a large quantity of retrovacs. It was the only known medical isotope that could halt the fast-spreading Crimson Plague that had broken out in the besieged, blockaded human colony on Vega 2. The colony had over 2 million civilians, a quarter of them children. The meeting point was a derelict station in the Ghost Head Nebula. Derringer knew it was a trap. The odds were 90 to 10. The Empire knew about the plague. They preyed on the one human weakness they identified, a ridiculous, illogical compassion for their own kind. Sending a fleet was out of the question. Sending a proxy was too risky. The Carthians would deal only with a top-level authority. He could ignore it and condemn 2 million people to a slow, agonizing death, or he could walk into the ambush. It was a choice between his own safety and the lives of his people. It was no choice at all. He went to the meeting with a small team of 4 security specialists, believing he could somehow talk his way out of the inevitable. He failed. Corthalis' elite Imperial Guard sprung the trap. The firefight was short, brutal, and fought in the zero-gravity corridors of the derelict station. Derringer, to the surprise of the Imperial soldiers, was more than just a talker. He moved with grim purpose, his sidearm barking as he put 2 guards down before a stun blast caught him in the chest. He awoke in binders, his head throbbing, a trickle of blood drying on his temple. Corthalis stood over him, his face impassive. The Grand Marshal had his prize. He had won the engagement, but he won it by exploiting the very trait his own culture had forgotten how to value: empathy. Derringer was dragged in chains onto the bridge of the unquestionable mandate. The sterile air was a stark contrast to the gritty asteroid base he left behind. Emperor Vergox was there, his image broadcast across the entire Imperial network, ready to gloat over his final victory. When Derringer was captured, the Ascendant Guards searched him. They found his battered induction lighter and the crumpled pack of Red Death cigarettes. They scanned him for hidden explosives, data chips, or listening devices. Finding none, they contemptuously dismissed them as carcinogen delivery systems and tossed them onto a tray with his other mundane personal effects. Now, as the Emperor began his triumphant monologue, Derringer saw his chance. "Your pathetic, chaotic resistance is over, human," Vergox sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are a glitch in the perfection of the universe. What kind of species thinks it can defy us with garbage ships and rabble?" A Trixorian guard stood near Derringer, his back to the tray of confiscated items. He had seen the human broadcast on the secret network. He had seen his own people die for Ascendant pride on Mars. His younger brother was one of the damaged assets left to die in that canyon. As Derringer made a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his weight, the Drexonian guard chose that exact moment to turn and check a meaningless console reading on the wall. His broad armored back shielded the human's actions from the view of the Ascendant officers for 2 crucial seconds. It was enough. Derringer's chained hands snaked out, his fingers closing around the lighter and a single precious cigarette. He straightened, the chains rattling. He locked eyes with the Emperor, a cold, defiant fire burning in their depths. A flick of his thumb, the lighter glowed. He lit the cigarette, the small act of rebellion, a supernova of defiance on the pristine bridge. The kind, Derringer rasped, his voice a low growl that cut through the Emperor's triumph like a shard of glass. He took a long drag, the smoke seeming to fill him with strength that only needed you to lose. Emperor Vergox's face contorted in pure fury. The sheer audacity of the chained, defeated primate was more than he could bear. "Execute him!" he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "Execute him now!" Just as the guards raised their plasma rifles, a massive concussive explosion ripped through the bridge's aft section. Red emergency lighting bathed the chamber in a hellish glow as alarms blared, a frantic, panicked rhythm. On the flagship's main hangar deck, 2 levels below, Harbinger watched the Emperor's broadcast on a wall-mounted monitor. He saw Derringer's quiet act of defiance. The Emperor's reaction was the true signal. He watched the divine ruler of 1,000 suns shriek like a spoiled child having a tantrum. It was the confirmation. Their god was weak. The moment had come. Harbinger turned, raised his heavy Drexorian-issue pulse rifle, and fired a single deafening shot into the chest of his ascendant overseer. The shot echoed across the Drexorian private comm channel, a thunderclap of rebellion. Across the flagship, and then rippling in like a shockwave through the Imperial fleet, the Drexorian legions turned their guns on their ascendant officers. The carefully constructed fist of the Empire clenched, only to find its own fingers now breaking themselves. Harbinger's voice, raw and powerful, roared over the comms. He spoke in his harsh, guttural native Drexorian tongue, a language of stone and hardship instead of the precise formal ascendant he was forced to learn. "For Drexor! For freedom!" On the planet-sized data center of Ordinatus, Scribe Veritas 7 monitored the data streams. He registered the Drexorian mutiny as the final catastrophic system error he predicted. The Emperor's irrationality had led to the logical, inevitable breakdown of the system. A hard reboot was required. With the calm, emotionless touch of a surgeon excising a tumor, he executed a command he designed weeks ago. He named it the Great System Correction. It was a perfectly legal, system-wide logistical update of such catastrophic proportions that it would shatter the Empire's ability to wage war. His meticulously planted, time-delayed bureaucratic traps sprang all at once. Reinforcement fleets were rerouted to uninhibited systems on the other side of the galaxy. Ammunition and fuel shipments were purged from active manifest, flagged for purity inspection. The entire complex bureaucratic backbone of the Imperial war machine snapped in a single, silent, digital instant. The ascendant fleets, caught between a human enemy they failed to understand and a Drexorian mutiny they could not control, were suddenly blind, deaf, and starving. The equation was solved. The irrational variable was eliminated. Order, of a sort, was restored. In the pandemonium on the Unquestionable Mandates Bridge, a Drexorian pulse rifle blast shattered Derringer's chains. Harbinger stood over him, flanked by a handful of his mutineers, their faces grim and resolved. The slog through the ship's corridors was desperate, clumsy, and brutal, not a glorious battle. Ascendant loyalists, though outnumbered, were well-armed and fighting for their lives. "There's a service junction 3 corridors down!" Derringer yelled over the chaos, trying to be tactical. "It should bypass the main choke point of the central lift!" Harbinger grunted, a sound of dismissal. He looked at the reinforced bulkhead in front of them, then at the ascendant fire pinning them down from the far end of the corridor. He made a decision. "The route is forward," he growled. Without another word, he lowered his shoulder and charged, smashing his armored body straight through the metal wall with a deafening screech of tearing durasteel. He used his rifle butt to widen the opening. Derringer could only sigh and follow the giant walking hole in the wall. Their combined chaos was brutally effective. Derringer's strategic mind identified tactical weak points on the fly, power conduits to be shot, fire suppression systems to be triggered, and Harbinger's raw, unstoppable brutality exploited them without a moment's hesitation. They fought their way towards the ship's auxiliary bridge, the only place to regain control and end the fight. They breached the auxiliary bridge with a shaped charge. Grand Marshal Cor Thalis was there, his immaculate ceremonial uniform torn and smudged with soot. He personally directed a handful of loyalist officers, his voice calm and level even as his world crumbled around him. He saw Derringer and raised his sidearm, his expression one of weary resolve. He expected a final physical confrontation, a duel between commanders. Derringer ignored him completely. He shoved past a sparking console and slammed his palm down on the ship-wide comms panel. The bluff had to be perfect. He couldn't imitate a specific voice. The ship's computer would detect that in an instant. He needed to trick terrified, doctrinally bound soldiers who were desperate for orders, not a computer. He leveraged his entire life's work, the culmination of a decade spent studying dead languages, for this exact desperate scenario. He spoke not in the common tongue, not in the courtly dialect, but in the high command crisis tongue, an archaic and formal language used only in the gravest of emergencies. The language was designed to bypass conscious thought and trigger an immediate, instinctual response in the Ascendant Warrior caste. All fleets, this is Command Authority. Derringer's voice, filtered through the comms, was imbued with an ancient, unassailable authority. The Emperor has fallen. A traitor has seized the throne. Execute Contingency Zero. I repeat, Contingency Zero is in effect. Disengage and regroup at the core worlds. For the survival of the Empire, disengage now. Cor Thalis stood frozen, his pistol lowered. The words, the language, the contingency. It was the obscure, paranoid relic he himself dismissed as irrelevant just days ago. Contingency Zero. Lineage decapitation in the midst of a mutiny. With communications in chaos and the flagship's bridge under assault, a clear order spoken in the correct authoritative crisis tongue was a lifeline they would cling to without question. He watched the view screen, his heart turning to ice. One by one, the loyalist ships began to turn. His ships. The glorious fleet of the Ascendant Empire, the pride of 1,000 suns, broke their lines and ran. They abandoned the battle, the flagship, the war. They obeyed a lie spoken by a human in a dead language. He finally understood. It was never about ships or soldiers or territory. It was about breaking the idea of the Empire. It was about proving the sacred, infallible grand doctrine was just a fragile piece of paper. He looked at Derringer, the scruffy, unimpressed human who toppled a 1,000-year dynasty with a shrug, a few lines, and an unshakable refusal to play by the rules. Strexorian soldiers, Harbinger among them, surrounded him. Cor Thalis fought. He raised his weapon. He simply gave a small, weary, almost imperceptible nod of respect to Derringer. It was the wordless acknowledgement of a master strategist who had been utterly, completely, and magnificently outplayed. Deep in the main command center, the play came to its ignominious end. Harbinger's troops captured Emperor Vergox IV, the voice of the Grand Doctrine. His divine authority shattered. It was reduced to a sputtering, enraged old man in a fancy suit, shrieking impotent threats at aliens who no longer feared him. Weeks later, the war was over. The Ascendant Empire was a memory. It collapsed into a dozen warring factions, a brutal civil war that would likely burn for a generation as old grudges and new ambitions tore the galaxy apart. Robert Derringer sat on a battered supply crate on the hangar deck of a newly christened Trexorian cruiser, the Unchained. He watched Harbinger, now a general and a leader among his people, oversee the painting of their new banners. A broken chain on a field of gray. Derringer looked tired. He looked older. The lines on his face seemed carved deeper by the weight of it all. But for the first time in a long time, his eyes held peace. The air smelled of ionized metal and fresh paint, the smell of new beginning. Harbinger walked over, his heavy footsteps echoing in the cavernous bay. He stood before Derringer, the gesture one of respect between equals. "The galaxy is in your debt, human," Harbinger said, his voice a low rumble. "The Shailene scribes have open trade routes with everyone. The other vassal species have declared independence. What will humanity do now? Will you build an empire of your own from the ashes? You have earned the right." Derringer slowly shook his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled pack of red deaths. Only one remained. He placed it between his lips and lit it with the familiar silent glow of his induction lighter. He took a long, slow drag, holding the smoke in his lungs for a moment before exhaling, watching it curl and dissipate into the faintly metallic air. He looked at Harbinger, and for the first time, a wry, tired smile touched his lips. He took the cigarette from his mouth and ground it out under his boot heel, a final, definitive gesture. Too much paperwork. Harbinger stared at the human for a long moment. The statement so absurd, so profoundly anticlimactic, that his mind struggled to process it. The conquerors of his experience would have seized this moment, their ambitions stoked by victory. This tired man who had personally unraveled a galactic dynasty looked at the ashes of an empire and saw only administrative tedium. A low rumble started deep in Harbinger's chest, a sound he hadn't made in decades. It grew into a full, booming laugh that echoed off the hangar walls, startling nearby Drexorian engineers. It was the sound of a being who had forgotten what true freedom felt like, and was only now rediscovering it.